Namaste and good evening, everyone. My name is Kishan Bhatt, and I am a part of the Vichar Manthan team in London. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you for joining us today. We are, of course, amidst very interesting times at the moment, which gives us time, a notion that we have all perhaps taken for granted, time to explore topics we have always wanted to, time to reflect, and time to use technology a lot more than we are used to. And for me, it's been given me enough time to grow my beard. This is one of the first ever purely virtual Vichar Manthans, and perhaps the first of many to come, I'm sure. Vichar Manthan as a concept has been running for over 40 years, but its current format was developed around 4 years ago in Leicester. Vichar Manthan, if understood literally, means the churning of ideas or thoughts. It is this aspect of Hindu philosophy that Vichar Manthan is based on, and is a reflection and churning of Hindu ideas. Vichar Manthan provides a Hindu platform for earnest thinkers to permeate earnest ideas throughout society and to build a better, cohesive, yet plural society. Our motto is to learn, live, and share Hindu ideas. We believe that the wisdom locked within Hindu culture can help modernize society and innovate new ideas to build a better British society. So, tonight we are gathered to discuss and explore our topic. Is our sexuality the root of our identity? A dharmic perspective of LGBTQ identity in modern Britain. And tonight we will hear from distinguished speakers who will be introduced by our chair, Vidhu Sharma, who will facilitate the discussion today. The general format for today will be that our speakers will get to speak, and then our chair will ask them a number of questions. So grab your chai, I have mine right here, grab a samosa, get comfortable in your living room, and enjoy this discussion today. I will now pass you on to my colleague, Vichar Manthan, Vidhu Sharma. Vidhu is a content producer, a poet, comes from Slough, and is also a fellow colleague of the Dharma Press Initiative, a publishing house for Indic civilizational ideas. The latest project of the press being Beyond the Bindi, an anthology of essays exploring perspectives of British Hindu feminism and womanhood. So over to you, Vidhu.
Thank you, Kishan. I'm really excited to be facilitating this discussion for you today on LGBTQ+ and the dharmic perspective. I think it's really important to reiterate what Kishanji has just said about Vichar Manthan meaning the churning of ideas. This is not a platform for providing conclusive answers to any of the themes that we discuss, but it is very much about opening the dialogue to discussion and earnest inquiry. The crux of the discussion this evening is our sexuality the root of our identity? Have we in modern Britain become obsessed with our sexual identities and gender binaries, or is our defense of our sexual identity warranted? The LGBTQ+ community has undeniably faced much violence throughout British history and around the world. Less than 400 years ago, under King Henry VIII's rule, male homosexuality was punishable by death. And it may shock some of you to know that across the world today, there are still places where homosexuality is punishable by death. Female homosexuality didn't even come into the question in British Parliament until less than 100 years ago in 1921. And it wasn't until 1967 that the Sexual Offences Act was passed, which legalised male homosexuality between men over the age of 21 if conducted in private. Yet despite this, the question begs, has the conversation been drowned out by more provocative voices? Or is there a dire need for the LGBTQ+ community to assert themselves, to raise awareness loudly and proudly, and for the rest of us to be allies? What is the cause and consequence of a society that identifies so strongly with its sexuality? We're here to manthan this very topic, today. And I have 3 expert witnesses with us who will help us unpack some of the ideas surrounding this topic. The format of the evening, as Kishanji mentioned, is that each of the expert witnesses will have between 8 to 10 minutes to share their initial opening thoughts. And then once we've heard from all 3, we'll have a Manthan and dialogue some of the ideas that have come out of those opening statements. And then it will be over to you guys at home on Facebook Live. Make sure you're writing your questions throughout the discussion, because we're collecting them and we'll hopefully get through all of them at the end of the discussion. So don't wait till the end to get those questions in, just type them as we go. So I'd first like to start by introducing our panel of expert witnesses. First, we'll hear from Dr. Jonathan G. Woolley. He is a social anthropologist, a druid and a diviner. He has published widely on English folklore and natural spirituality, and he's a member of the OBOD, the Druid Order's LGBTQ+ fellowship. Once we've heard from him, we'll move on to Bhavit G. Mehta. Bhavit G is a festival director, an events producer, and an LGBT expert. He works closely with the British Library and has advised the Home Office on LGBT matters, and has been quite outspoken about the gay British Asian experience on BBC Newsnight. So we're really keen to hear his thoughts this evening. And then finally, we will hear from Dr. Rishi G. Handa, Head of Sanskrit and Religious Studies at St. James's Boys' School, with a PhD in Hindu and Sikh studies. So it'll be very interesting to hear his take on identity from a dharmic perspective. So we'll start with you, Dr. Jonathan G. You have 8 minutes, well, maybe 10 minutes, but I'm going to be very strict on time. And I think the benefit of us doing this virtually is that I can keep my eye on that clock. So I'll be taking no prisoners. Please feel free to take the platform.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Vidulji. It's really an honor to be here and to be invited to speak about such an important topic in such an august forum as this. So, you know, firstly, I think I'd like to make a kind of a proviso on my perspective. I don't necessarily think there's anyone who would really seriously argue that that the vast complexity of human identity can be reduced to any specific expression of it, including sexuality. You know, unless you're talking about it in a very prosaic sense and saying that, you know, all of our identities are rooted in the sexuality of 2 people that was expressed in their union and love for each other that gave rise to our conception and thus us being here. But that's not what we're talking about this evening. But it's important to note, I guess, that there are certain strands of Western philosophy, particularly ones that have developed since the Enlightenment, so the sort of, you know, sort of 1800s kind of time, that have really celebrated sexuality and have drawn a greater focus on sexuality as a part of human identity. And of these, the queer theory and the various conversations and ideas that inform the LGBTQ movement are one strand of that. Another is the broader, you know, sexual liberation movement of the 1960s, which encompasses a lot of, you know, heterosexual expressions as well. And another strand of that broad current in Western philosophy is expressed in certain forms of spirituality, including my own tradition of Druidry. So this focus that I mentioned, this kind of increased focus on sexuality amongst all those strands, isn't without its risks and problems. There are issues that it does throw up and it generates. But I think it's worth to sort of start by just explaining why this happened. Firstly, from a kind of a socio-historical point of view, so what social processes cause these strands to emerge over time. And second is to look at them slightly briefly from a deeper, more spiritual perspective as well. So firstly, that socio-historical perspective. It's important to note that these forms of sexual liberation in Western philosophy arose in reaction to a very sexually repressive cultural milieu which prevailed across Europe for about sort of 2,000 years, under the auspices of the various sort of subdivisions of Christianity, ranging from the Roman Catholic Church to various forms of Protestantism, Eastern Orthodoxy as well, where sexuality wasn't really celebrated. To varying that applied to varying degrees, but in general, Christianity has had a very strong strand of itself, very much historically, that identified celibacy, so a forswearing of all sex, as the ideal. This sort of can be traced back right to the Bible, to the early church and the Christian fathers of the early church, figures such as Paul the Apostle, who authored large sections of the Bible. And he very much felt that celibacy was fantastic, was a way of getting closer to God, and that marriage, and as an institution, was only really a concession that God made to prevent people from sinning, from falling out of favor with God further. So basically, God said, in general, you should be celibate, you should devote yourself to prayer and to avoid sexual contact. But realizing that that's unrealistic for most people, God was kind enough to create the institution of marriage, which served the purpose of creating children, and also sanctified sort of sexual relations between a man and a woman for that narrow purpose. And that prevented people from expressing their sexuality in any other way, right? So they had only that channel to direct it down. And basically those worst transgressions are literally any other form of sexuality. So whether or not that's autosexuality, so, essentially masturbation, whether or not that's homosexuality, love between people of the same gender, multiple sexual partners, even things like female enjoyment of sex and female control of reproduction were all viewed as repugnant under the context of this previous sort of era. Even just having sex for pleasure was viewed in a very dim light under this sort of regime. And this had the effect of encouraging vast numbers of people who felt deeply and profoundly ashamed of the sexual sides of their nature. People started to really feel deeply ashamed and embarrassed about their urges to express their sexuality in different ways. So, I mean, I think something we were talking about previously as a group before this sort of talk began was how, and some of my colleagues will be talking about in much more detail than I will, but sexuality, like all aspects of our identity, is very fluid. It can change over time. Human identity is mutable, and that's very much something I'd agree with. But like all fluids, if you try and stop sexuality from flowing and it pools in one place, it can stagnate. If you try and keep it beneath the surface, it causes pressure to build. If you try and keep it away from certain areas where it should flow, you can cause a drought. And floods if you cause it too much of it to flow in one place. So the purpose of the West's sexual awakening at its best is to relieve the pressure, to alleviate the drought in areas of where sexuality was forbidden, such as in homosexual relationships or sex for pleasure, and to remove toxic stagnation in places where it was mandatory and obligatory and used to coerce people, such as in the context of heterosexual marriage, historically in the West. But there is a deeper spiritual dimension to this whole process. As I've highlighted earlier, my spiritual tradition really embraces sexuality and views sexuality as a fundamentally positive thing. Druidry doesn't seek to reduce things to sex or state that sex is something that should be our sole concern. But it's a very powerful source of energy that can help guide you, that can help be a source of potential and can help actualize yourself and help channel those energies into great creativity and wonderful things. Other related spiritualities such as Wicca or witchcraft, in those contexts of Wicca, in fact, the sexual union between God and goddess is viewed as being like the central, most sacred rite within the tradition. So ultimately, the key lesson to be drawn from this is that this source of energy, it can't be, I wouldn't necessarily call it the root of all identity, but it's certainly a fountain that fuels our identity, that fuels us with a kind of life force called muifre. And that we should acknowledge and celebrate that and channel that correctly in order to avoid psychological and spiritual harm. So if we channel the energy raised by sexuality correctly, it guides us in a better direction. So it's no different to anything else that can do that. So eating and drinking in that respect, it's something to be celebrated, to acknowledge, but not to be done to excess. So I guess the final point I would make about this is that this tendency to embrace mortal, the qualities of mortal existence, eating and drinking and sleeping and the needs of the body, including sex, is something that's very characteristic of Western philosophy in general. This idea to kind of like not see the cycle of life and death, the cycle of samsara, as being something to avoid or transcend, but something to ride and to sort of and to embrace. Is very characteristic of modern Western philosophy, including Druidry, and I think perhaps is a little bit less wary than some dharmic perspectives that you see in other parts of the world. So, as I say, I think this focus on sexuality is not without its risks and downsides. It would be great to talk about that later, but let's continue on with the discussion after that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan G. Yeah, a really enlightening view of why there are now some more negative connotations with the LGBTQ community and the voices that come out of it. Bhavit, I wonder if you agree with the points made by Jonathan G, and if you could spend the next few minutes sharing your opening thoughts on the topic.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear the views of Jonathan, a bit of a background, a bit of a crash course for history in the story of LGBT communities in the UK. And I mean, I have to first of all say that I'm very happy to be part of the discussion, but I'm by no means an expert at all on any of these things. I've not written a book. I'm not an academic on these things, never really researched anything in these things. I can only really talk from a personal perspective and share my own story and my own thoughts, really. And it's interesting that in this country things have really progressed in the last 20, 30 years so much. In the last 10 years so much. But for the British Asian experience, for the British Hindu, the British Indian LGBT community, things haven't progressed at the same rate. We were sort of about, I'd say, 25 years behind the rest of the UK in terms of attitudes towards these things, coming out to families, gay marriage, relationships, all of these things. We're catching up. We're playing catch up. The good news is that we are progressing. We are moving ahead, but there's still a lot of work to do. I can share a little bit about my own story, my own life, I think, to begin with, and then take it from there. So I grew up in this country. I was born in the UK. In the 80s, things, homophobia was still pretty there, especially in the Indian communities, Gujarati communities. So I grew up in an atmosphere of constantly hearing homophobic comments and talks, and being exposed to all those things. I come from a very traditional Hindu Vaishnav family, of East African origin. I don't want to use the orthodox, but very traditional. And so when you grow up in that environment, almost from the age of 4 or 5 or 6, you kind of know that one day you're going to get married, one day you're going to have children. I still have sort of nephews who at the age of 8 or 9 would say things like, when I get married. And I'm thinking, gosh, you were 8 and you already know that you're going to get married one day. And I guess I was the same when I was a kid. Every time I observed my own behavior, I could see myself that I was behaving a little bit differently. My views, my interests were different to other boys, particularly during the teenage years. And I tried my best to fit into that, try to conform to that. And fast forward a few years, I think at the age of sort of 2021, my father passed away, and I felt it very important to try to do what he would have wanted me to do, which is to complete a family. My father was eldest of 6 brothers. I'm the eldest of 12 cousins, but we're like siblings. We're very close, and so there was also that setting an example for the others. And one thing, I always had an interest in Hindu spirituality, so I'd always been involved in lots of Hindu activities. I worked with Rishi who's going to be speaking after me on something called the Hindu Youth Festival, which is in 2001, so many years ago. And for so many years, that community of my Hindu friends, predominantly my straight Hindu friends, that was my social life. And so again, I felt the need to conform constantly to that, because I didn't know any other gay people. And there were no role models, there were no cousins, there was no one in my local community, there was no one in my local temple who was openly out, openly gay, who I could talk to, or who I could just go and sort of, have a chat with. And there was no one like that. I did eventually get married, but it was sort of a very dark episode of my life. It wasn't, I realized immediately that I made a big mistake. And if I carry on with this, I'm going to sort of, ruin the lives of many, many people. And so after some time, I did eventually come out. But that process of coming out, I used literature and books, and I work in the literature sector. I've been an avid reader ever since I was a kid. And for many years, I would try to find characters in literature that I could resonate with, that I could relate with. And one of the first books I read was Hanif Qureshi's The Buddha of Suburbia, and there was a sort of a bisexual character in that. And that was televised on the BBC Two drama. And I was totally gobsmacked, because I finally found someone who I could relate to. A few years later, Vikram Seth's A Suitable Boy, where there was one of the characters in there showed some very special friendship with another guy. And again, the words used, the description used was just mind-boggling. A few years later, I read E.M. Forster's Morris. I've got my books here. I'm going to be sort of doing a bit of displaying of the books as well, just to make it interesting for you. But Morris by E.M. Forster is still one of my favorite books. It's made into a film. And again, the feelings of someone who was brought up in an environment where those feelings were repressed. So I found language for this. But the book that really changed my life was by a writer called Christopher Isherwood, very famous British writer, who became a Hindu in his life. He was in America, and he met Swami Prabhavananda, who was from the Ramakrishna Mission order. And he became a devotee of the order, and he became a monk. But he constantly struggled with his sexuality and his spirituality, his sort of bhautikta and his adhyatmikta. And he's put this in this beautiful word, my guru and his disciple. And it's the complete relationship between him and his guru, and how he battled with this, how he had that sort of manthan, the churning in his head between these two quite conflicting things, or he thought were conflicting. And then towards the end of the book, he finds a way of balancing them. And I guess reading this book totally changed my life. It's the one book that has changed my life. And it gave me the confidence that I can still be a Hindu, I can still be spiritual, I can still believe in my philosophies. At the same time, I can also not deny other parts of my identity. And that gave me the confidence to then come out to my family and my friends, and to the wider world. Is that 8 minutes?
Well, thank you for sharing. That's quite a deeply personal account of your journey. I wonder now, Rishiji, if you could shed some light on identities and the kind of dharmic perspective on whether we should be attached to them, much like what Dr. Jonathan G said about post-enlightenment, celebrating those identities. Do you have any thoughts on that dharmic perspective on that?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. Just to put a little caveat here, I'm by no means an expert in LGBTQ+ issues. It's not my area of research, it's not my focal point, so I'm going to be coming at this from a philosophical perspective, because philosophy is my area. So there's two questions here. What is the dharmic perspective, and what is the adhyatmic perspective, what one would call the spiritual perspective, but I think adhyatma is a much better word, pertaining to the self, pertaining to consciousness. The dharmic perspective, now, as Bhavaji said, in the community find it difficult to deal with their young people, their children, coming out with certain identities that aren't straight. And it's because of a certain conditioning, of course, and it's certain expectations, and I guess the importance that is given on continuing the family line, and therefore having kids. It's really the edifice of that sort of perspective. Ultimately, to mix it in with a little bit of a spiritual perspective, ultimately there is the idea that we're all made up of a certain prakriti, certain nature, and we can try and deny that as much as we want to, but our prakriti is our prakriti. We're made up of it in a certain way. And one of my areas of interest is Jyotish, is Vedic astrology. In there, one can see very clearly from a chart what the nature of one's sexuality is, whether they're heterosexual or whether they're homosexual. So it's very clearly rooted within the prakriti of an individual. My interest is a bit more towards, however, I'll keep to the dharmic side for a moment. In the West, we've taken to these things a lot more recently about identities that are not male or female, or not just heterosexual. What's interesting in terms of transgender, for example, transgenders have those with transgender identity. They've been around in India for a very long time. They've not only were they just males and females, but there was the third gender, and it was recognized. And we see them now, of course, present. They attend the births of children, and people give them money. So they're recognized and they have their place, they have their importance, and they're given their respect. They're not denied. From an Adhyatmic perspective, so really this goes down to Vedanta. The question of this is sexuality the root of our identity? Now, with identity itself, the Vedantic perspective is that we have two identities. Our apparent identity, which is that of the psychophysical aspect of ourselves, the body-mind complex. And then there is our essential identity. So I'll come to that in a moment. We tend to give an importance to, we identify so much with our body and our mind. And we treat them as who we are. I'll give you an example. I mean, we're in the age of where Instagram is quite used, and it's more a case of putting pictures up of oneself, far more than, say, Facebook. And it's about image. It's about personal image, physical image, okay, facial image. Something to think about when somebody says, say somebody says to a girl, "You're beautiful." The individual receives that compliment. But what do they mean by, what do they understand by they're beautiful? They identify with that. They identify with their face. Vedanta holds that you are not your face, of course, you're not your body. And if it's about the person, their personality, well, that's made up of one's thoughts. And so these are just ideas. This is mind stuff. This is the content of mind. It's still not the individual. In fact, funnily enough, the individual who has that sense of identity, that I am the body and I am the mind, is that idea is just itself a thought. So when a person is addressed as beautiful, then really, if you probe deeply at it from an Advaitic perspective or Vedantic perspective, who is it that's being addressed as beautiful? There's no one there. There is simply consciousness witnessing all that's happening. So this goes back to this goes into a deep investigation of what is the nature of identity? What is the nature of who we are? Can we locate who we actually are? So going back to the Vedantic perspective, there is an apparent identity that we have, which is a body-mind. But our essential identity is the awareness in which this body and mind arise. They exist in consciousness. We have multiple identities, but these identities are all ultimately rooted in the mind. The body is rooted in the mind, and the mind is rooted in consciousness. There are some who deny the external and just only look at it from the essential identity perspective. But that would be to deny even a part of ourselves. Essentially, there is this character that this actor, the actor consciousness is playing. And essentially, we're denying the character of who we are. So I think the point is not to deny that aspect. You're on the world stage. Engage with the play. Understand that you're a character in the play. But don't identify with it absolutely. And it's this whole point about absolute identification. Recognize that this is a part of who you are, or it's the apparent identity that you have, but it's one identity.
Thank you, Rishiji, for sharing that. Just a few reflections that I made throughout that while that makes theoretical sense that we must not identify absolutely with the mind, in the here and now, in my physical body, this identity, in this social, economic, political environment, this identity matters. My sexuality is central to that identity. So, Jonathan G, could I ask you to reflect on this idea that maybe that identity is diminished, the importance of the human body, the human experience, our human need to belong is diminished by this idea that we must not identify absolutely with our sexuality. I know that you mentioned that there are strands of Western philosophy that celebrate and encourage that identification. Could you maybe just share a little bit more and elaborate on that for us, please? You're on mute, sorry.
Yes, always forgetting that. Yes, no, I'd be more than happy to elaborate a little bit. I think it's a really wonderful exposition on Vedanta and that perspective. And I certainly recognize that there are many people for whom that sort of perspective and that outlook and the forms of ritual expression that can that help you reach that state of contemplation is a tremendous solace. However, I think the point I suppose I would make is that if that, and I guess this is Rishi's point earlier where he said, you can't sort of abolish the play, as it were. You can't, totally efface the fact that you're a character in the play, which is that it wouldn't necessarily obviate the need to either identify with a particular group of people or a particular sexual identity, or to express that identity. Because if it were sufficient, then you would not see any expressions of sexuality in dharmic societies, and that's obviously not the case. Because as we've talked about, if we expand it from sexuality just to talk about sort of gender and sexuality, so we talk about the full LGBTQ spectrum. The presence of a third gender in India clearly shows that there is and the honoured status that is accorded within a dharmic context shows that is valuable and is important. Equally, the fact that there are Hindu marriage ceremonies shows that they are and the fact that there is marriage shows that there is a sort of, and it's an occasion for celebration, shows that it has some role. It's an important point to note that within Christianity, marriage was not recognized as a sacrament until relatively late. It was actually, for a long time, marriage was just a civil arrangement that you made with someone that a priest may or may not bless for most people. And that was because marriage wasn't seen as being particularly sacred. Sexuality was seen as being slightly dirty and something you shouldn't be ultimately doing. So I think certainly within certain strands of Christianity. So I think the point I would make there is that you've got to ask the question, where, like, of clearly there is some good and some real importance to according some level of celebration and expression to identity, even if you hold this view that all identity is fleeting. The question is where is that done enough? Where is that done too much? And where is that done too little? And I think in the case of LGBTQ people, it's in a Western context, it's done too little. And as Bhavit was talking about very eloquently about his own personal experience, I would venture that that is a context in which he felt, and certainly I felt this as a gay man growing up in a white British household, like, you know, that my identity as a gay man was not being sufficiently acknowledged. I wasn't supported through that experience, and a lot of what Bhavit was talking about sounded very reminiscent for me as well, and I really recognise that. So I think the question is I think pride serves a purpose in a gay context because we don't have enough of identity, whereas in a broader Western context, I can well see how sexualization could be almost too much identification, if you like. But I wouldn't put that in the LGBTQ bracket. I'd put that actually on a broader kind of, you know, in certain manifestations of heterosexuality, I would say, are perhaps overexpressed. But we can talk about that more later.
And Bhavitji, would you agree with those sentiments? Touching particularly on the Vedic, during Vedic times, there potentially being up to 11 different genders, the third gender that exists in India. Would you say that this is considered normal? Could you just share your thoughts?
Sure. I'll say two things. So first of all, yes, the Hindu scriptures make lots of references to different types of sexuality. I love the word Jonathan used, a fluidity of sexuality. There are, particularly in the Puranas, there are 18 Mahapurans. There's so many Puranic stories, the Aitihasic stories, the historical, the mythological, what we incorrectly refer to as mythological stories. But they are filled with lots and lots of tales of sort of men becoming women, women becoming men, you know, men becoming pregnant. There's another book I would like to now show you called The Pregnant King by Devdutt Patnaik. Even in the Mahabharata, there's a very popular story of Shikhandi, who was Draupadi's brother, but he was sort of, you know, born a male, but in his previous life was a female, and lived his life as a female. And the sexuality was very fluid. So there's tons and tons of references. Around the third gender, as Rishi mentioned, which in today's Indian culture, you know, the Hijra community, yes, they're respected. Yes, they have, you know, they are invited to come to weddings and birth ceremonies, and they're given money because their blessings are seen as very important in those moments. But apart from those moments, they're not treated with respect. So despite the fact that the Hindu scriptures do pay reference to these things, and there was probably a period where there was a lot of open-mindedness about these things. Look at the Khajuraho temples, the carvings of the various characters in the Khajuraho temples. You see lots of nude characters, you see lots of men with men, women with women, all sorts of things like that. And you know, these were carved hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Every single sacred text has somewhere a mention of Kinnar. Kinnar is essentially the third gender. So the scriptures talk about it, but at some point, society has not followed that, or there's been a change in the thought in Indian society. So that's, I think, very important, that it's all well and good to say Hinduism accepts this, Vedic culture accepts this, but actually, in reality, that hasn't always transcribed. The second thing I'd like to say is, with regards to our identities, we put tags on ourselves, right? So we are, for example, I might see myself as you know, British, I'm Indian, I'm Gujarati, I'm Hindu, I'm of a particular sexuality, I'm a particular job or a career, I have a particular political view, etc., etc. Now, these identities don't need to be in conflict with each other, in my opinion. These identities don't need to be like layers where some are at the top and others are at the bottom. Some need to be hidden and others need to be exposed. I think if we look at them as, I mean, I heard in one of the talks I programmed many years ago, I heard a very beautiful expression or a beautiful story where if you look at identities in terms of the rings around a circle, in a tree, the circles of a tree, if you look through the trunk, you see all these beautiful rings that are living in harmony with each other. And I think that if we refer to our identity, if we look at our identities in that sort of way, then they can all live quite comfortably with each other. And I guess there are some of those identities that can change. So our political view can change, our religion can change, or what philosophy you believe in can change, our careers can change. But the color of your skin, difficult to change. Your ethnicity is difficult to change. Your citizenship you can change. But then when you come closer and closer, sexuality, yes, it might be fluid. Yes, it may change, but the likelihood of that is a lot less. And then all of these rings can live in harmony. And I think that in question to what's the root of identity, I think let's not look at it in terms of root, because that tries to identify the main thing, the one big thing. But let's look at them as the trunk, the tree trunk, and all these identities living in harmony that allow you to grow.
Okay, fantastic. So Rishi, I'd like to, in light of that, pose a question to you. To what extent is religion responsible for historical homophobia? Can all religions be tarnished with the same brush? In light of what we're talking about in the Vedic times and this fluidity that was understood and accepted and respected in these indigenous civilizations, is there an argument to suggest that dharma has been tarnished by colonization or it's been Christianized? Could you shed some light on that idea? How have we managed to regress? How are we now in a state where we aren't upholding those same values, those same dharmic values, and we're not living in line with it as much anymore? So the crux of the question being, has dharma been Christianized?
I'm probably not I'm not fully qualified to answer this, but I think I'm not also going to be able to give a nice, clear-cut answer that people might be expecting. I've had former students. I remember one particularly who came out, and he was quite a devout Christian. And he continued on with his university education. When he left school, he did a university education in theology, and particularly Christian theology. And the thing he wanted to focus on was on homosexuality in Christianity. There are a variety of views within Christianity. So for us necessarily wanting to say that Christianity has a very clear-cut perspective on things, I don't know if it's that black and white, especially the Hebrew Bible, what Christians would call the Old Testament. That may have some strict perspectives about homosexuality, and negative ones, of course. May not be the case with the New Testament because of the nature of what Jesus is teaching. It's very much from a spiritual perspective. Islamically, that one seems to be, let's put it this way, Muslims who are straight really do push that homosexuality is against Islam. Yet there are Muslims who come out as gay. In my general studies of Islam on this topic, because I teach religious studies and we discuss a number of topics, I've yet to find a Muslim justification, Quranically speaking, for homosexuality. I've yet to try and understand how they reconcile homosexuality and still being a Muslim. But that's not for me to deal with. That's just my general interest, curiosity. With the Hindu perspective, I think we need to be cautious about looking at texts and saying this is how things used to be. Remember, texts are a perspective of an author or authors at different times and at different places in a certain land. Now, there are going to be, just like there are today, in every country, there are people who are oppose certain things, there are people who are for certain things. And that variety would have existed in India on this issue. It really comes down to where you are. I mean, the customs to do with marriage, for example, customs up in the north and customs in the south are very different. And some customs which would seem morally reprehensible to the north, the south practices, and vice versa. Okay, so I think there would have been a real variety of things. So that objection to even the things that Bhavik was speaking about that are in text, those objections would have been around, because those people wouldn't have necessarily followed those texts. Texts just represent the ideas of a few elite thinkers, a few elite writers. They don't speak for all. So whether it's a case of it's been Christianized, I wonder. I mean, that itself is a research project.
Bhavik, do you have any thoughts on what Rishi has just shared?
Unmute myself. Yeah, I agree that not everybody in those times would have agreed with this, but it was certainly around. People acknowledge the acknowledgement that this is a thing. There is a third gender. There are people who have these different sexualities. That acknowledgement would have been there, which at some point we even lost that acknowledgement. We even lost that ability to accept that this is such a thing, and the way that these alternative sexualities were talked about through media and Bollywood and all of those things for such a long time, show how negative these things were seen. I mean, overall, if historically, and Jonathan, you can probably talk about this a lot more, but I always suspect that in Eastern religions and in Eastern thoughts, including Far East philosophies, the concept of trans gender was much more accepted. And in the West, the idea of sort of, in Greek philosophy, men with men was much more accepted. And that's perhaps why in India, certainly, or in Asia, South Asia, the trans community, the Hijra community, have got a place in society. They are accepted. I think India was one of the first countries to actually have trans toilets, at a time when America was still debating whether they should have them or not. So in America, homosexuality, gay, lesbian, has perhaps been more accepted, and trans people have an issue with. But in India, that's the other way around. So that's just an observation.
Okay, so I'd like to now move the discussion kind of back to present day. We've covered that there are ancient civilizations that have reconciled the LGBTQ plus movement for millennia, and it's not even a point of contention, and it's not a topic that gets repeatedly discussed with every generation. But here in modern Britain, just 12 months ago, we had certain communities in the UK that were, up in arms about LGBTQ plus relationships being taught in schools. And that was, less than a year ago that we were really strongly debating that. So, Jonathan, I wonder if you could shed some light on where you think the LGBTQ plus movement is going. What are some of the current issues and risks being faced by the community, and what does the future look like?
Thank you very much. I mean, I think I'll add to the chorus of people today saying that I'm not an expert, and this was very much my area of expertise is more in sort of nature religions and so forth. I know more about what they say specifically about LGBTQ issues, but as for the movement as a whole, it's definitely not my area. But I can give my own personal view as a member of the community. As Bhavik Ji said, we've come on absolute leaps and bounds in our recent years in this country. When I was at school, in primary school, it was basically illegal for all teachers to make any positive references to homosexuality. So growing up as a kid, I had absolutely no idea what was going on when I hit puberty and started being attracted to guys. I didn't know what this was. I had absolutely no cultural references to make sense of that at all. And that left me with, a certain measure of psychological trauma. I was extremely confused for a very long time. And I had this kind of vague sense in my heart that there was something, the reason why I didn't know what it was and the reason why it didn't make any sense was because it was bad and because people didn't want to talk about it. It wasn't as good as being straight. So even though I wasn't in a very homophobic environment, I wasn't surrounded by people being actively anti-gay, the fact that no one was pro made me feel like this wasn't something I wanted to be. And I feel like that's something that we're moving away from as a society. I feel like there are increasing numbers of conversations going on within all communities, actually, in this country, about LGBTQ plus issues. And I feel that that increased awareness and that increased dialogue is meaning that even though there are people, much as Rishiji said, probably always existed, who are really aggressively and homophobic or transphobic, I feel as a community we are talking about this more, and there are more positive narratives out there. There's more inspiring stories out there. And what really inspires me is I see a younger generation of queer people coming up and basically not having the same wounds that I experienced. Now, I didn't have the wounds that say members of my members of the gay community have from back when it was illegal and from the HIV epidemic, which absolutely devastated the British gay community. I don't have those wounds because I didn't live through it. But just as I don't have those wounds, and I had the benefit of a safer environment to grow up in and to become an adult in, so I feel the coming generation, like the younger generation now, have an even more welcoming environment. I'd say there's still a long way to go. Trans phobia is still really widespread. People are still very hostile in this country in many places to trans people. There's a great deal of healing and I think work that needs to be done there, where LGBTQ activists need to show solidarity with trans people and understand their specific needs and experiences. I feel that an increasing awareness of non-binary people, so people who don't identify as as male or female at all, I think their voices are increasingly being heard, which is wonderful. I think what we really need to now focus on, and I feel like this is why this conversation is really cool, is heeding the voices and raising the profile of LGBTQ plus people of colour within the broader gay community, the broader kind of gay and queer community in the UK. Because I think for too long, that has been kind of sidelined because of racism and white privilege and a whole host of other things. And I feel that we're now starting to give the varied experiences of all LGBTQ plus people more of an airing. But we're still, I'm not saying, I don't want to sound kind of triumphalist and say everything's better now, because it certainly isn't. But I think that is the thing that I'd like to see more effort focused on in future. And that's why I'm really, really glad that this conversation is happening. And that, because I think partly because it gives Bhavitji a platform to share some of his experiences and to talk a little bit about the particular struggles that he's faced.
Thank you. I think you've touched on something really quite beautiful there, that not being homophobic doesn't necessarily mean being pro-homosexual or advocating that behaviour. Bhavitji, I wonder what your thoughts are on this idea of sexuality being respected in the dharmic tradition. Is there an argument that no sexuality is respected? The only thing that is respected is this idea of motherhood, fatherhood, dharma. Your sexuality is just your inclination, your temperament. It's just something you acknowledge and then you move on. And also then to touch on Jonathan G's second point about we're now moving into a space where voices of colour are being acknowledged. What is your experience of that? Bhaviji, you're on mute. Sorry.
Okay. I think when doing my own research in the Hindu scriptures, I think there's lots of references to, like I said, variety of sexualities and things like that. And often the language used is that of sort of, this can be tolerated, rather than fully accepted. So I think that, these things have been tolerated, but not completely embraced. And so that's something that we've all had to live with, right? So when you come out in this country, when a typical gay Hindu or lesbian or bisexual person comes out to their families, more than likely, I think, in a Hindu family, particularly the North Indian family, I think that there will be a level of acceptance. I think people who've been here for 30, 40 years, they came via East Africa or South Africa or whatever, they've lived here, they watch the news, they watch TV, they watch EastEnders, they see Graham Norton, they've got colleagues at work who are gay, etc., etc. And so there's a level of awareness and understanding and education about these things. And so they will be accepted. I think for a lot of other communities of other religions, it is a lot more difficult. What Rishi was touching upon are, Muslim friends who, might find it very, very difficult to try to find that balance between their spirituality and their sexuality. Something has to give. But actually many people have found a way of balancing that. They have decided to sort of see this book, see this text as not the final thing. It's a perspective given by at a particular time. And so there's the essence you can take from that and not follow it in the letter of the law. So there's letter of the law and letter of the spirit. I think if people take religious texts as a letter of the spirit, and try to understand the essence of it, but not necessarily follow it step by step completely, then it can be a lot easier. In today's age, I think in modern Hinduism, we find a lot of the sampradayas, these sects or the organizations that really, and the gurus that really have interpreted the scriptures and written it in their own way. So I think it's wonderful that Vichara Manthan is doing a talk on this theme. I don't think you would have done this 5 years ago or even before, but you've shown that you do it. But I'd be really, really happy to see when the Swaminarayan Mandir in Neasden, the famous Hindu temple, the most famous temple in Europe, when are they going to host a talk about LGBT issues? When are the Hare Krishna temples going to organize a talk about the LGBT issue? When is the Pushti Marg Sampradaya and the Shaiva Sampradayas and all the other various different sects of Hinduism that are run by organizations or run by gurus or run by a particular, main temple or a main organization? It's time. There's still a lot of room for this subject to be not just accepted, not just tolerated, but also embraced. And I think that there's that room is still there, and lots of work needs to be done. I think for a lot of young gay men and women living in Britain, I think it's very easy for us to sort of survive in the current way it is. It's okay if our families don't accept us, if our friends don't accept us, if I can't go to my local temple because they'll all raise their eyebrows. It's okay. You know what? It's fine. I can survive in the current climate, but actually I can't thrive. And it's about thriving. That's what we need to do.
So we're obviously honoured to be hosting and potentially paving the way for further discussion in other sects. Okay, I'd like us to move on to the questions that have been posed by those on Facebook Live. I think we've had a really fruitful discussion, and it will continue because we've had loads of questions come in. Just want to touch on George's question. It was one of the first to come in, and you can all unmute yourselves for this section when I read it out, and whoever would like to jump in can. So this is a question from George. Do you think there is a danger that the LGBTQ plus movement can create a narrowed identity that may alienate other LGBTQ plus people who don't align with it? So just to add to that question, is there is there an orthodoxy within the community, or is it open and accepting? Are there any accounts of peer pressure that you can share with us? Whoever would like to take the mic on that one.
I can maybe say just a few words. That I think that human nature, human beings, you know, if we have a tendency to be prejudiced, to be egoistic, to be all those things, that the perception that gay people are wonderful and lovely and, you know, warm-hearted and accepting of everybody is not true. There's also huge amounts of racism in the gay community. There's huge amounts of sexism. There's a huge amounts of body shaming and all of these things. So yes, I don't like the word LGBT movement, actually, I hate that word, but movement of any kind, because it's sort of, it suggests that what happens in a movement is some people move ahead and others are left behind. And so we need to all sort of go in an inclusive growth capacity where we're all moving ahead at the same time. But yeah, at the moment, I do think that the LGBT movement in the UK is going in a way where it's leaving behind a lot of people between the lines, between the cracks, and they don't know where they can turn to. And Jonathan, you might be able to talk about this a lot more, actually.
Oh no, I mean, I was just agreeing with absolutely everything you said. You know, the gay community is full of people, and it's also very much people who have been brought up in a wider society, and so you'll see, just as you'll see racism, sexism, and even homophobia actually in wider society, so you'll see it within the gay community. I think I kind of, you know, more broadly under the whole LGBTQ umbrella as well. So what I do think is that inclusion is an aspiration, and it's a responsibility, and it's something everyone within the community should be working on. So for anyone who has gone to an LGBTQ space and felt excluded, you know, I mean, I've been to spaces occasionally where I've felt excluded for all sorts of reasons. Being a really hairy teenager can sometimes, you know, mean that you become a victim of some of that body shaming. If you don't conform to this kind of very stereotyped ideal, yeah, you can feel that. But that said, I think that, as I say, that ambition to become more inclusive and that responsibility that many people take really seriously and really act on, I think that is really valuable and is something to be cherished and nurtured by each of us.
Thank you. Thank you for your thoughts on that. A question from Thanvi on Facebook Live is, would like to see some more discussion on bisexuality as well as female sexuality. Both are very important topics for me. And personally, this was a slight reservation coming into this discussion, was about female voices on the panel. And it's not to say that anyone here is an expert and this is a conclusive discussion that we're having. Would love to redo this whole discussion with a different panel and have other experts on it. But in your opinion, do women have the same experience as you're illustrating today? That could go to anyone again. Maybe you could lead on it, Bhavik.
I can say a few words. I think it's a lot harder for women. I have a number of lesbian friends who are of South Asian origin, Muslim, Hindu, and also Christian, Indian. And it's so difficult. It's so difficult, I think, especially if you are from the same sort of a traditional, you know, Gujarati or traditional Pakistani family or traditional Indian family of any kind. The expectation for you to marry and have children is so much more. It's that conditioning happens at such a young age, and the expectation is so much more, that for those young girls or those women to sort of eventually come out, it's actually a lot harder. And I think it's amazing, that it's brilliant that more of that is happening now. I've even seen photographs of a Hindu wedding ceremony between two Hindu women. I think it's amazing. People might disagree with that and think, oh, it's against the religion, and where did they find the ceremony from, and all that kind of stuff. But I think that there's plenty there that allows for that. There's plenty of ways of interpreting these things that can allow everyone to feel that they are comfortable with who they are. But yeah, I think it overall is quite difficult for women at the moment. I can't talk much about the bisexual experience. I can't talk about the trans experience. I've got friends who identify themselves with all of these things. But I think like Vidhu said, there should be another event with a different type of panel for that.
Definitely. And Jonathan, did you have anything to add to that?
No, absolutely. I completely agree. I think the experience of women is going to be very different to the experience of men, and I think the experience of cis women is going to be very different to the experience of trans women. I think because the community is so diverse, you'll get a huge range of experiences there. But again, I think the point about bi-erasure and also lesbian erasure, I think a lot of lesbians and a lot of lesbians will get their voices get marginalized within the broader LGBTQ plus community, and as very much the same with bisexual people in general. I would also say that I think there's an interesting dynamic where trans men also it's a way that trans men experience misogyny as a result of their assigned at birth gender, where they're just almost vanished from conversations about trans rights and trans conversations. And it's a way in which the fact that they were assigned as women at birth kind of travels with them as they come out and undergo transition, for sure.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. Rishi, a question directly for you. Is marriage universal from a Hindu perspective?
Universal?
Or mandatory or encouraged, or what are the definitions?
It's encouraged, but it's not mandatory. There are those who just aren't inclined that way, for whatever reasons. So it's encouraged. I mean, you have there, it's one of the sanskaras, one of the 16 sanskaras. And progeny is important, continuing line is important. And if we look back in society and we look at villages, you'd like to use villages as the kind of reference point, because most of traditional India is agricultural, and really it's to have those kind of networks, to have that support in old age. So marriage was encouraged, but it was never absolute. I mean, we see sadhus and fakirs everywhere. Some of them have left. They've been married and then they abandon it, but sometimes it's because of certain traumatic things, and they just it's just an escapism. But for others, they just incline towards a spiritual path, so they want to renounce. But it's by no means mandatory.
Rishi, can I ask you a question? What are your thoughts on gay marriage in the Hindu community?
So it's a complex one, isn't it? So here's a question. Is vivah the same as marriage? Now, one could say I'm playing semantics here, but actually conceptually, what is marriage in a Western sense, or in a Christian sense, or in a Protestant Christian sense, as opposed to Catholic one, in an Islamic sense? And what's a vivah? And what is the purpose of that? I can't give a definitive answer on that. I mean, I've raised questions myself about the fact that there are same-sex vivahs going on. Is that even a meaningful thing? Because if a vivah is supposed to be between man and woman, because of the nature of what a vivah is, then maybe it's something else that needs to take place. Well, one of my friends showed me that there was, you find in the Ramayana, that Sugriva and Ram go around a fire, but it's not, of course, not using any Ved mantras or anything like that for a marriage, because that wasn't the nature of their relationship, but it was to solidify their friendship, to concretize their friendship. So, of course, we don't have any precedent and any Graha Sutras or anything like that about a Vivah ceremony. I don't know.
An interesting question that comes off the back of what's just been said is a question from Poonam Kakkar. What influence do you think the Mughals and the British Raj had on the minds of Hindus in those days when it comes to sexuality? Bhavik mentioned earlier that we now simply tolerate the LGBTQ plus community, whereas it seems from some of our earlier discussions that it wasn't just something we tolerated or accepted. It was something we celebrated. It was something that was very much a part of society. And I know that Jonathan G mentioned about how this idea of refrain, am I saying it right? How sexuality was considered a powerful source of energy, and that was very much the case in the Vedic times. So some people may put some of the changes down to the Mughal or British Raj. Can anyone answer or provide any insight as to what influenced those two very major movements in India had on people's consciousness, people's perceptions of sexuality?
Can I throw one little thing in? I think we ought to be cautious of romanticizing things in India, and we have a tendency to do that, and always put the blame on either Victorian ideas or Christian ideas or Mughal ideas. I mean, there were homosexual things going on amongst the Mughals too. I don't know if the other experts are more knowledgeable about this. With some of the the courtiers and things like that having young boys, and equally there are things in the ancient Hindu texts where homosexuality is seen negatively. Okay? There's a variety of ideas. That's the point. That's the point I made earlier. There's a complete variety of ideas.
Yeah,
but it comes down.
I agree with Rishi. I think that we do romanticize what things were like back in ancient India, those wonderful days before all of these other people came in our country, and we end up talking in this rhetoric, and we shouldn't think like that at all. I think that Indian psyche, Indian thought has evolved over time, and I think that yes, there are lots of scriptural references where it almost suggests that homosexuality or different types of sexual identities were accepted, and then there are others where they are very much criticized. I mean, the Manusmriti, seen as one of the sort of major law books of the Hindu faith, is incredibly critical of the third gender, of the transgender. It accepts that there's a third gender, but it actually completely disgraces it. And yeah.
And there's punishment in there, or suggested punishment for lesbian activity, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, I think it's an important point to sort of say, just as Rishi pointed out, as sort of a general point, that you don't want to overly stereotype or simplify positions in the ancient world historically. That also applies to sort of Christianity going back over the time periods that I've been talking about, because even though this was an era where the official position was very much, and the focus was very much on celibacy as the most virtuous option, and that in various ways sexuality was treated as being profane, in a Catholic context being associated with original sin. There are obviously other narratives and other stories and other accounts, ways in which people have resisted that, even in extremely homophobic milieus or or sexist milieus. And I think for me, it's very much a question of focus. The question of looking back at the past is a central aspect of what Druids have to do, because so much of our tradition has been, swept away by the tides of history and so on. So basically for us, the central question is, where do we want to put our focus? What is relevant for us to draw as a lesson from now? And so we don't need to sort of romanticize the past in order to do that, because we can just sort of say, this bit is really useful to my present experience because it helps me contextualize my relationship with my gay son, or with my lesbian best friend. Whereas this bit, which tells me that those things are bad, puts me in an extremely awkward and difficult position that makes no sense for the modern period. So I wouldn't want to take that lesson.
Okay, just to do some justice to the comments that we're getting, we are getting a few comments talking about how the British criminalised homosexuality in India, and what the influence of Islam was on Hindu society. But in order to stop us kind of going around in circles, and as you've already mentioned about not romanticising the future, I really like this. Personally, I really like this idea of sexuality being seen as a powerful source of energy. So in order to take the conversation forward now to where we are today and going forward, how do we create a society that harnesses the power that our sexuality gives us? Does anyone here have any thoughts on what we can do to move the conversation forward, away from debating whether it's right or wrong, but actually seeing it for what it is? And how do we take that? How do we create a powerful society full of individuals who are spirited, and use it to their advantage?
Jonathan said, oh, go on, Robert, sorry.
No, go on, please.
So Jonathan said something earlier on about channeling, and about, using the metaphor of I think, was it like water? Yeah, which was a really nice metaphor. It made me see things from a very new perspective. There's Napoleon Hill's very famous book, Think and Grow Rich, and in one of the chapters, I mean, this book is supposed to be one of the foundational texts, if you like, for the idea of the law of attraction. And one of the chapters, he talks about sex transmutation. So it's transmuting that sexual energy. And effectively, it's been there in the yogic tradition. I don't know too much about Tantra. I have friends who are more greater experts than me on this. So what the connection is, I can't say. Maybe somebody here can. But yet there are yogic techniques. So in the book, he doesn't. Napoleon Hill doesn't talk about how to do it. He simply talks about it. From a Kundalini perspective, that place, that source, it's the creative center. It's the center. It's the center which has that energy, it's so powerful that it creates life. It creates children. But instead of either repressing it or wasting it, what the yogic tradition has tried to do is to channel it. And so that creativity gets passed out through other areas. Now, if we could do that, we could effectively turn people into superhuman beings, because it's the most powerful energy. But yet, it's not something that's generally talked about. But that sex transmutation would be a very powerful thing for society.
Love it, Jay. Jonathan, do you have anything to add to that? Or in response to the question, how do we harness our sexuality and create a powerful society?
I think all I'll say is I don't know if we need to harness it. I don't think we need to see this as some sort of superpower that we have. It's like every other aspect of our identity. Like I said, those layers, those rings in the tree trunk, they all have a purpose. They all exist, and they all need their space, and they're all pretty equal in the way that they are. And I think that this is just, rather than harnessing it, rather than trying to find this way of unleashing this amazing thing, our sexuality, and making us, jump mountains. I think just actually accepting ourselves. So those people who do identify themselves as LGBTQ+, accepting yourself, loving yourself for who you are. I think that's the that's the fundamental thing that needs to be done. And most of the problems and issues that you find in the gay world, the kind of behaviors that LGBTQ+ people might display that are often seen as the negative behaviors, things with sex, things with drugs, all these things, a lot of it actually roots down to the fact that you haven't accepted yourself. There's a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, that you've grown up with, and then that gets displayed in lots of negative ways as you later on in life. And so just accepting yourself, loving yourself, healing yourself. If you've had a traumatic experience of being a child that's in the closet, if you've had a traumatic coming out, if you've had you've been rejected. I mean, I feel very blessed that my family, uncles, aunties, everybody, everyone's really accepted this. I totally underestimated them. So I feel very lucky and very blessed. But there are lots of people who unfortunately don't have a similar story. And so if they've been through that kind of negative experience, then actually you need to heal yourself. So these are the things that you need to do as an individual who identifies yourself as LGBT. And for those friends who are not gay, lesbian, or whatever, but you're interested in this, or you know someone who is, becoming an ally. There's a term, the LGBTQ+ ally, becoming someone who helps them, become someone who accepts them, someone who not just tolerates or accepts, but embraces completely. So there's a role for all of us to play in this.
I really love this. I think that's beautifully and eloquently put. I think the importance of acceptance is absolutely key. And I don't know who first used the word harness, and maybe that I mentioned it or when I was in my introductory remarks, but I'm going to reserve the right to sort of review my comments now, and I'm going to sort of pose back the original question, Vidaji, with another question, which is, this is, I think, coming from a very particularly Druidic perspective here, which is, how do you harness a river? The point is, you can't harness a river, right? Even if you use the river to irrigate a field, or if you sail down the river, or if you put a mill on the river to ground grain, you've not harnessed the river. You've not, stopped it from doing what it's doing. What you've done is you've simply learned to live with the river. You've learned to organize the way other aspects of your life and other aspects of how you perform to fit what the river does, because it's a river, right? A river flows, a river floods sometimes and goes low at other times. It, wants to go towards the sea, and the best way of working with a river and making sure you can do all those good things is to accept it as a river. If you start, getting angry in the manner of Xerxes when he had to cross the Bosphorus, and whipping it because it wasn't behaving itself and wasn't allowing him to invade Greece, then you were just going to end up impotent, and you're ultimately going to fail, I think. And that's one of the key lessons, I think, from people who attempt to suppress their sexuality or to bottle it up, is that it often becomes utterly fruitless and either harms them or people they care about. And I think that's why acceptance is so important. And that's not to say that, and I think this is the role of a lot of the kind of the way that we work with sexuality within a Druidic context, is we don't try and sublimate it, we don't try and transform it into something else. What we do is we simply embrace it, and then in the act of embracing it, that liberates us and it empowers us to be as wonderfully and dazzlingly creative as we can possibly be. And that, I would argue, is something you see within the context of the gay community. If you look at how glorious a drag queen's like robes are, it's coming from that outflowing of self-expression and that sense of pride in oneself, but not a kind of a toxic pride. It's, in the sense of pride comes before a fall. It's a sense of self-respect and self-acknowledgement, and self-acceptance.
Can I just say, personally, I've loved this river analogy. I think it's really helped me, as a lover of words anyway, it's really helped me contextualize this spectrum of sexuality, and to see it less as something that we can just wear as a badge. And I think that's that badge metaphor has always kind of been associated with any type of identification. Right, I'm afraid that is all that we've got time for. I'm sure we could be going on for hours and hours talking and monthening and churning these ideas. But I really want to implore everyone at home, if you've found this to be a fruitful discussion and you've learned anything new, please continue the conversation with your family and friends. Please give us your feedback, get in touch, share your ideas. This conversation has only just begun. Vichara Manthan is not about providing conclusive answers yet again. It's about opening that discussion and dialogue. And it's been a very humbling experience for me over the last hour and a half to listen and to facilitate this conversation. And I feel just listening to some personal experiences has really added to the objective nature of a platform like this. So I'd like to thank each of the speakers for sharing their ideas. And over to you now, Kishanji, for closing remarks.
Thank you, Vidhu, and thank you to all of our enlightening speakers that have given such an interesting and thought-provoking insight into the dharmic perspective of LGBTQ identity in modern Britain. Thank you to all of our online audience. There were some very good questions put to the panel today. And if you have missed this VM or want to watch it again, then you can do this by going onto our Facebook page. Now, as Bhavit stated, we quite often shy away from discussing this topic. But today at this VM, we have addressed this topic openly, transparently, and almost with a sense of collaborative dialogue and understanding. We understood the cause and consequences of perhaps what identifies us so strongly with our sexuality. We obtained and understood ideas of socio-historic points of view and the spiritual point of view. We obtained a very personal perspective from Bhavit and the particular struggles in the past. We've got a view on Prakriti and our intrinsic nature as humans. Are we now moving into a more accepted space for the LGBTQ community and the Hindu community? Is it well embraced? Is it seen as a powerful source of energy, or does sexuality merely require us to accept people for their identity? We continue to discuss and we continue to think. So look out for our new virtual Vichara Manthans once a fortnight, live streamed on our Facebook page. I'm sure a lot of you are going to be sitting at home. So this would be a fantastic opportunity for you to have a look at more of our discussions. It's on facebook.com/Vichara Manthan UK. And now as an organization, we survive on the generous donations of our well-wishers. So we have developed a well-wishers fund. So do help us explore these ideas and help keep our discussions alive. And do this by donating generously, by making a monthly contribution to support our cause. What I will try and do is share my screen with you so you can see our website. So you can see here's our website, Vichara Manthan, there, vichamanthan.org. If you click on About Us, and if you scroll all the way down to the page, you'll see a section which allows you to contact us, which is just here, highlighting here. And that will help you donate to us as a well-wisher, and we really value the contribution you make. If you scroll further down, you can see you can join our mailing list to learn, live, and share our ideas. You can subscribe now. And you can also look at our events and our video library to see previous Vichara Manthans. If you go onto our Facebook page, please do try and join and sign up to our Facebook page, like it, share it, see what you can do, spread the word. The more people that watch these kind of events will definitely help spread the education out there. So you can see that there's been loads of activity on our Facebook page. So yes, thank you again for joining us. Shubh Ratri, good night, and stay tuned for Vichar Month. Thank you.